Okay, we've just crossed the hour, and welcome everybody. My name's Tim Rockwell. I'm chairman of the Energy and Utilities Business Committee at BritCham in Singapore. We've got a very active committee. Thomas is a member of it, and we've pulled together this webinar for you on ASEAN Green Power Grid and green imports to Singapore. I expect this might be one of the last online webinars that we do. Our next event coming up will be a live event at Singapore International Energy Week on October the 28th, and I hope that people can join us for that one. But one of the good things about webinars is that we can bring people in from overseas, and I'm very pleased to say that we have Ofgem's Deputy Director Offshore Network Regulation, Stuart Borland. We have Thomas, as I mentioned, Thomas Briault, Principal of ARUP here in Singapore. And joining us in place of Benny, who's had to travel to Russia and his plane got in late, is Akbar. Akbar is technical leader at the ASEAN Centre for Energy for Interconnection Master Plan Study, and he's going to talk a little bit about that as well. And Ian Webb, who's director of ARUP Energy Advisory in the UK, and going to talk about the good experience that the UK has got in interconnectors. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. This is an interactive session, so there is a dedicated Q&A box. Please to put your questions in. I'm sure everyone's well used to that by now. So feel free, don't be shy, put your questions in. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Thomas, who's going to moderate the session with the panelists, and I'll join you at the end of that session. So over to you, Thomas.
Thanks, Tim. And good evening, everyone. Good morning to those in Europe. Thanks for attending this session, Interconnectors in Asia, applicable to Singapore, but also across APAC and I guess across the world. Thanks also to BritCham for hosting and organising this webinar and collating this exciting panelists that we have before you. So just a brief introduction to each of the panelists. Stuart Borland is Deputy Director of Ofgem's Offshore Network Regulation at Ofgem, the energy regulator for Great Britain. Stuart joined Ofgem about 10 years ago and has spent his career to date in roles across the energy markets and network regulation, delivering financing of infrastructure projects. And in his current role, Stuart is responsible for Ofgem's work on offshore wind coordination, the OFTO tender regime, and electricity interconnectors. He's committed to the delivery of a greener future for customers across Great Britain. Then, as you heard from Tim, Akbar is a last-minute stand-in, but I'm sure we'll hear some very interesting things from him about what the ASEAN Centre for Energy is doing on their interconnection master plan. And then finally, Ian Webb, an expert in program and project manager with over 30 years experience delivering complex projects. Ian's led the development and establishment of program and project management procedures and implementation phases of interconnectors within National Grid, supporting the development of their procurement program. And then most recently, he is and has been working on the development and procurement of NOI-Connect, 725 kilometre, 1,400 megawatt submarine interconnector that connects the UK to Germany. And he leads the ARUP FICNA JV. He can tell you a little bit more about that in a bit. So thanks all for being here today. My name is Thomas Briault and I'll be moderating this session. I lead energy for ARUP across Southeast Asia, and I've got a background in low carbon energy systems, and I've recently worked for the Energy Markets Authority on looking at their current power generation across their entire fleet and how that might change into the future, as well as also helping them quite specifically with the procurement of green imports to Singapore. So we'll hear from each of the panelists in turn. They'll give us sort of a 5-minute introduction with some slides and tell us a little bit about what they've been doing. And then I'll start by asking them a few specific questions, but as Tim said, feel free to put your questions into the chat box and I'll try to raise them there. So without further ado, let me hand over to Stuart Borland to outline how Ofgem have approached interconnector program in Europe. And over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Thomas. And hi, can I check that everyone can hear me okay? Excellent. Well, good afternoon all, or good morning for those of you who are here in the UK. And thanks, Thomas, for the introductory remarks. It's great to have the opportunity to join you all on behalf of Ofgem this morning. As Thomas mentioned, I'm Stuart Borland and I'm the Deputy Director for Offshore Networks at Ofgem. Ofgem, for those of you who don't know, is the energy regulator for Great Britain. And our role is to protect consumers by working to deliver a greener, fairer energy system. As a part of that role, we regulate the development of cross-border interconnectors, working very closely with government, with project developers, with our European counterparts, and with the wider industry. Today, I'll just give a very short overview of our experience on interconnectors from a regulator's perspective. I'll keep it fairly brief as we have about 5 minutes, but I look forward to discussing any specific questions further in the Q&A. So to start with, this first slide just sets out some of the context to GB's approach to developing and regulating interconnectors. I wanted to start with some of the history and the backstory because the context is important in shaping our policy responses, both in the UK and in Europe. And the steps that we've taken in the UK to date might not be suitable in all situations as a result. But GB historically is an energy island, given our geography. And that meant that there are a number of historical barriers to interconnector development. So first of all, technology. HVDC has matured as we've come along, but previously with a strong reliance on HVAC links, there was a distance limiter on connections between the UK and elsewhere. This brought cost, it brought development risk and technical risk, and then market design and integration, which I'll come on to a bit more later. We had our first commercial link, IFA to France, that was commissioned in 1986. So we've had that link for quite a while, but that was primarily for security of supply reasons in the first instance, and only later was more of a market trading tool. We then only saw 3 further interconnector projects come online in the next 30 years. So that's quite slow progress, and given the size of the generation fleet in GB, we've been historically quite underconnected. We saw Moyle come online in 2001, Britned in 2011 to the Netherlands, and East-West to the Republic of Ireland in 2012. But I mentioned market integration and liberalisation, and those really are fundamental pillars to the way in which the UK's interconnectors operate. So we saw a big drive for wholesale market liberalisation in Europe through the second energy package in 2003, and then built on that with the third energy package in 2009. And that set the conditions for trade between countries based on the price differentials in the different national wholesale markets. Interconnectors then became a key piece of the puzzle because interconnectors can improve affordability by transferring power from lower to higher priced markets, improve security of supply, as I mentioned previously, by opening up to a wider market area and a more diverse generation fleet, and decarbonisation, as we're seeing at the moment, by allowing us to specialise in regional types of low carbon power and to move those around when there are surpluses and when there are deficits. And then so the key conditions we found for the regulatory models that we've adopted in the UK were liberalised wholesale markets, long-term price differences driven either by fundamentals in generation mixes or by volatility in weather patterns and output, private investment and development. So the interconnector market in the UK is a private developer-led market. It's not state funded or state owned. And then cross-border political and industry collaboration. And we've been working very closely with our counterparts, as I said, both politically and in industry across Europe for a number of years. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. There we go, thank you. So this slide gives a very short overview of our regulatory framework in Great Britain. I mentioned the importance of the policy in the market context, and the design of our regimes reflect that. So we have a cap and floor regulatory regime for interconnectors, which is designed to be a hybrid market and regulated framework. It's based on costs in a typically regulated RAB model, in the same way that our network monopolies onshore are. But it acts on the revenues that interconnectors generate in the market. So when there are price differences between markets, that leads to trade on the interconnectors, and interconnectors earn congestion rent based on those differences in those trades. So our regime allows the market to operate and allows commercial signals to determine the investment by developers, but it provides a minimum and a maximum limit on the revenues that can be earned. Our aim is that this incentivizes developers to maximize their revenue and to operate efficiently, but it provides the long-term certainty they needed to underpin large and complex infrastructure projects. So the cap and floor regime itself here, I won't go into huge detail, but the building blocks are the same for those of you who are familiar with typical regulatory models in the energy and utility sectors. There is a floor that's underwritten by the GB system operator on behalf of consumers, and a cap, and so if revenues drop below the floor, they're topped up, and if they move above the cap, then those are paid back. So if we can move just onto the final slide, please. Thank you. And so this slide just includes a short summary of the projects that we've approved to date and our planned next steps. So to date, through Ofgem's cap and floor regime, we've approved up to a maximum of 15.9 gigawatts of total capacity. We've done that through 2 investment rounds in 2014 and 2018. That takes us up from a historical base, as I mentioned at the start, of 4 gigawatts. So it's been a significant increase and a real success in driving that new projects coming online. We're currently running a 3rd investment round at the moment, and a pilot scheme for multi-purpose interconnectors, which will integrate interconnection with offshore wind delivery. And those are both due to close at the end of the month. And this slide also just includes 3 headline learnings, which we might come on to in the Q&A slightly more. But for us, important things were to set our objectives early. So what's the purpose? What's the driver for the interconnection? What's the value that generates for the different stakeholders? To collaborate internationally. So political support is fundamental and is definitely needed. So the UK government and European governments have been really fundamental in driving that political support and buy-in internationally. And then to work collaboratively with industry on delivery challenges. And I think Ian might come on to a few of those slightly later. So I'm conscious of time. I'll stop there given the time that we've got. But I look forward to discussing any of this in more detail. And thank you again for your time this morning. Thomas, back to you.
Thanks, Stuart. Really interesting background from Europe there and from the UK. And I'll be interested to talk to you a little bit later on as to how that kind of background might apply here in Southeast Asia, and also, I guess, specifically to Singapore's case. Yeah, as I said, I've already got so many questions, but let me ask Akbar to describe what the ASEAN Centre for Energy is thinking about in terms of a power grid, and how that could play a part in Singapore's decarbonisation plan. Over to you, Akbar.
Thank you very much. May I check whether I'm sound is good? Okay, thank you very much. On behalf of the ASEAN Centre for Energy, I'm proud to be in this event to set a setting on this overview of the ASEAN Power Grid. As we see that the ASEAN Power Grid is part of the one of the 7 ASEAN Energy Blueprint for the cooperation that we have among the 10 ASEAN member states that it has the key strategy to expand the regional multilateral electricity trading in order to strengthen the grid resilience and also and the modernization of the grid, and to promote the clean and renewable energy integration. The ultimate goal of the ASEAN Power Grid itself that it has to construct the regional power interconnection, beginning with the cross-border bilateral terms. As you can see that there is a 17 list of the interconnection that are currently existing and the projected lines for the future interconnection that we hope that, and also we aim the goal to have this integrated by first to have the sub-regional terms, then by the overtime we could have the completely integrated South Asia Power Grid in the system. Currently, the ASEAN Power Grid has the existing interconnection capacity around 7,720 megawatts, which are currently the most of all of this happening in bilateral terms. Please, next slide. Yeah, as the team mentioned that ASEAN Centre for Energy conducted the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan Study, or AS3. This is the third edition of the ASEAN Master Plan for the ASEAN Power Grid, which in the third edition we continue to evaluate some comprehensive plans for capacity expansion and also the needed transmission network to support the realization of the ASEAN comprehensive cross-border power interconnection, and in order to allow the much higher penetration of the VRE that spread in the geographical area. And the M3 itself explains how the ASEAN could also achieve the target of regional energy. By 2025, we will have the 23% of the RE share in the energy share. And the three main of this study is that we provide to new updated ASEAN Power Grid plan that is to pursue the regional cooperation in the power and VRE sector. And the second objective is to evaluate the potential cross-border interconnection in economic viability, the optimal generation, as well as the comprehensive feasibility study. And the third is to enhance the energy connectivity and market integration to achieve also in the benefit of the energy security, the accessibility, affordability, and sustainability for all. This is the one of the jargon of the ASEAN region, and as that based on our M3 finding that the APG was acknowledged to support the better utilization of the RE resources. As through the VRE resource assessment, we estimate that the technical potential around 8 gigawatt of solar and 340 gigawatt of gross wind capacity per year. That we also identify the 60 variable renewable VRE potential site in the region, and it will be such an effort to advancing the clean energy and climate protection goals in the ASEAN, since the power system connectivity could increase the flexibility through effective utilization of renewable resource sharing across the geographical location for the common benefit of the ASEAN. And by 2040, the ASEAN will require 24 gigawatt of interconnection capacity with the increase of variable renewable energy penetration in the region. Next slide, please. And this is the current state of the APG with progress that we have at the moment. The Laos PDR, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore power interconnection project, where in the phase 1 we completed the power purchase amount of up to 100 megawatt transfer through the between Laos PDR, Thailand, and Malaysia, and the operational is during 2018 and 2018 with a total of 30.2 gigawatt hour. And the phase 2 of the power interconnection project happening in the 2020 until December 2021 with a total of 2.6 gigawatt hour electricity trading between 3 countries. And then the last one is the LTMS, or the with the additional of Singapore joined to this power interconnection project. We received the total amount of 72 gigawatt hour electricity being traded as of 31 July 2022, with the effective date or the convention date to this PIP only happening in 22 June 2022. And as today, that about 35% of Singapore electricity is generated using natural gas, which mentioned as the cleanest form of the fossil fuel that Singapore wish to have the energy suite for decarbonization plan. And one of the ways to tap into the regional grids to access the renewable energy that is more cost competitive. And this could be realized through this bilateral cooperation. And by that, the Energy Market Authority has been working on this power international project, which could be as the pave the way for the larger scale of electricity import, particularly on the renewable resources. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think that's conclude my short presentation. Please go back to you, Thomas. Thank you.
Thanks, Akbar. Very interesting to hear about the capacity across ASEAN and the capability to really share renewable energy across the region. And thanks also for stepping in at the last minute. I know that's always the hardest job, so thanks again for that. In some ways, very similar challenges to some of those described by Stuart, but in also some ways quite different. So interested to kind of discuss some of those differences in a bit. But before we kind of get into those questions, perhaps we can hear a little bit from actually delivering some of these interconnection projects and in particular subsea projects from Ian. So Ian, I'll hand straight over to you to tell us a little bit about the practicalities of actually installing subsea cable.
Hi there. So yeah, projects like this, you always get some really good photographs, big projects, and lots going on. So I'll have a few photos to show as we go. But if you go to the next slide. So my name is Ian Webb. I'm a director at Arup and I lead the energy advisory team in the Midlands. I'm also the project director for the Arup Ficna joint venture, which is currently supporting the NeuConnect interconnector project. That's a £2 billion investment, interconnector between the UK and Germany that's currently in construction. So myself and my team have been supporting interconnector projects now for the last 10 years through the feasibility and development, consenting, procurement and construction, and we've worked on the majority of the UK interconnectors in some capacity or other. And we're currently supporting, like I say, the NeuConnect project across the project management, aspects, cable and converter technology support, SHEC and health and safety, consenting and environmental aspects, regulatory support, and where we are at the moment, it's the early phase at the moment, and we're doing some of the civils works and enabling works that are just allowing up the beginning of that project construction. So on to the next slide, and I'll talk a bit more about NeuConnect. So NeuConnect is a 1.4 gigawatt bipolar interconnector and Wilhelmshaven in northern Germany. It's the first interconnector to be built between the UK and Germany, and is that's being provided by Meridian, Allianz, and Kansai, the Japanese utility. It's being delivered in two main lots, two main contracts. One to Siemens for the HVDC and converter technology at each end of that interconnector, and the cable is being supplied by Prysmian, and that's a 700-kilometer long cable going through UK, Dutch, and German territories. The total program duration is 6.5 years, and commercial operation date is expected in September 2028. If you can go to the next slide. So Arup have formed a joint venture with Fichtner. NeuConnect is a client, coming from sort of that private developer, privately financed project. They're a relatively small project team, and have lent into Arup to provide some significant skills and resources through that both development and construction phase. We've created this joint venture to really bring in skills from across the challenges that we're going to see, and there's a few sort of photographs there which show some of those challenges. And so we've got UXO down in the bottom corner. People like the pictures of the big stuff, and on the left hand side you're seeing a plough for the cable laying operation, as well as some delivery of some pretty large kit that's going to come to site. So some significant challenges through the construction phase, and like I say, we've come together as a team to support the client through that. Next slide. So what I really wanted to end here with is just to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing in the market. Really, having sort of lived it for the last 8-10 years, it's we've seen some changes, but the first thing I'm going to start with is not a change, but in actual fact, people the projects have really stayed with the traditional suppliers, the ABBs and Siemens, and we're not as yet seeing a shift to low-cost manufacturing centres and the supply from those sort of alternative technologies. That hasn't come into place yet, which is surprising because we're really seeing some significant supply chain constraints. It's a very buoyant market, lots going on, both in interconnectors, obviously in offshore wind, with a lot of the same skills and manufacturing capabilities that are required. And that is a concern, I think, for all of the projects moving forward, is that supply chain constraint. Obviously, one of the other things that we've seen is, many of the early interconnectors were being developed by the TSOs, the transmission system operators, and we're now seeing that independent developers and private finance are seeing the opportunity that these projects provide for energy trading. That in turn has that other impact, which with these sort of independent developers, they're obviously having to go to the marketplace to find the operation and maintenance sort of service contracts as well. So that's we're seeing that come into play. We're seeing longer programs and more flexible programs that are being offered by the developers because of that, again, of that supply chain constraints, that they've obviously got to fit their program around what is the capability of the suppliers. So that enables them to negotiate more favorable terms, but you have to work with that supply chain to be able to optimize your program. I think, as Stuart mentioned before, we're obviously now seeing the bootstraps and multi-purpose interconnectors being developed, and I think that will be significant change, our next sort of change that we're going to see. We're seeing now increased offshore coordination that's required. Obviously, it's a busy place there, as we're seeing all of these projects being developed, and that is absolutely crucial. Players, other sort of stakeholders become very active in helping that coordination of the offshore network. Again, it's a bit of a common theme, but the skills shortage across the supply chain is also a significant concern. It's quite interesting about how we went through the development phase, that it was really had to liaise with the supply chain quite closely, let them understand the viability of the project, and help them to look ahead for the resources that the project is going to require. And you can see that we're really going to have to think about that skills shortage, and how we really build the skills to build out the ambition that we're seeing. Obviously, very topical at the moment is the geopolitical issues and security of supply. Obviously, seeing what the impact of Ukraine's having, and the actual security of this infrastructure is going to be important to think about going forwards. So all of this is starting to create new thoughts about how entrants can partner with each other, how they might subcontract, and how they can start to bring a little bit more flexibility to that supply chain and the way that projects are delivered. That's just a sort of a bit of an intro of the kind of things that we're sort of seeing, and what are the constraints, and yeah, some of the opportunities as well. Back to you, Thomas.
Thanks, Ian. Really interesting presentation about some of the challenges there. And one thing that kind of struck me, and perhaps I'll come to you first, Stuart, is how when you take the UK European situation and compare it to the ASEAN situation, where particularly in the case of Singapore, import of renewable low carbon electricity into Singapore is a primary aim. So we're talking unidirectional interconnectors. How do you see some of those supply chain issues, some of those challenges that Ian highlights, and some of the learning you have from Europe, perhaps applying in a slightly different market?
Thanks, Thomas. I think it's a really good question, and in my presentation I talked about the importance of setting clear objectives up front, and that's really sort of what I meant there. I think that the technology will be largely the same, right? So given the scale of the challenge, the distance of the connections that are needed, and the amount of megawatts that we want to be able to move around, the technology will be largely comparable in the European and the ASEAN contexts, but the drivers will be different, and the revenue streams and the commercialization will be different. And I mentioned the European model being based on trade between different wholesale markets, and that developing revenue for generators. That leads itself to a number of sort of funding models and regulatory models. A one-directional link to import renewable generation contractually will lend itself to a different type of commercial model. And so I think, just touching on the trends that Ian mentioned, I think that there will be scope for a number of parties to be involved, and a number of possibly contracting and subcontracting strategies to sort of be common across the two markets. But the really important thing for the ASEAN situation will be agreeing in advance between the parties involved what those models are, how those are being funded, whether that's sort of long-term PPA type contracts, whether it's regulatory backed, whether it's government backed, and then taking that proposal to the market. And then I think the supply chain aspect, the delivery of those, those cables and those converters, I would expect to see reasonably similar processes and designs coming out of that. There may be, depending on the pipeline of projects coming forward in the ASEAN market, there may be differences in delivery timelines and things like that compared to the European situation. But I think the market offering, once you've got that clear model and that proposal set up front, the market offering should be relatively positive in response to that. And I would expect there to be, a fair amount of interest.
Yeah, that's it's interesting about the different market models, because here, as I said, there's import for decarbonisation. I expect some of the archipelago nations like Indonesia and the Philippines to be moving power between the islands, but also when we're talking internationally, we're really talking about a different commercial model. So in terms of coming to you, Akbar, in terms of kind of thinking about that commercial model and talking about phase one that we've that has now been achieved with the ASEAN Power Grid, how do you kind of see, because it's a significant scaling up to start talking about different scale. I think you talked about 30 gigawatt hours the year 2018 to 19, which is actually only a few megawatts on average. How do you see that market developing in ASEAN and kind of driving expansion of the entire grid?
Thank you very much on that. As the let me go back to the power interconnection project that happening between the Laos PDR, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore. That is the one of the project that are being flagship by the Ministerial of the Energy during the ASEAN Ministerial Energy meeting. That however, the technicality and the commercial itself, it should be look at the readiness of the of each of the country involved. Let's say that if the Laos PDR are ready to transfer the 100 megawatt of hydropower to Malaysia, let's say, as the purchaser, and then they will send that megawatt hour of the hydropower to Malaysia, and that should be happen. The readiness should be looked at by each of the country involved. That's why in the 2019 and 2020 or 2020 to 2021, the LTMS phase 2, we see the less gigawatt hour of electricity trading between those three countries. And by the current development of the LTMS, we see the fast development of this interconnection project, which as the said could be a pathway to scale up on these renewable resource to Singapore. And as we see on how we could scale up from this power interconnection project beyond the LTMS, we see that as our study estimate that with by 2040, the ASEAN will require 24.3 gigawatt of interconnection capacity, with a lot of investment needed required to achieve this target. It's around $771 billion US. And currently, ASEAN in 2021 around already built 7,072 megawatt of cross-border interconnection. and the snail pace of this progress may be seen from the outside, still lacking of the harmonization, regulatory, the technical issue, and the commercial regime between the countries, where the government funded the project as primarily invested in infrastructure through the state-owned enterprises or SOE, and as the market itself, the part of the which hinders the progress is the type of power market that mostly dominated by the state-owned enterprises that could not see the opportunity for the private investment to come to this development of the APG. I think I would stop by now. Go back to you, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's interesting to see what might really drive some of that investment, and as you say, the state-owned utilities really mean that I guess the development of a power grid will need to think about the G2G relationships across the region, and obviously the recent moratorium from Malaysia on the export of renewable electricity from Malaysia, at least temporarily, means there are some challenges there. It still seems a little unclear to me exactly what Indonesia's position is on that. So interesting discussions to come on the development of that. But assuming those kind of G2G issues can be overcome, I just wondered, Ian, kind of from your perspective, if there are some of those particular challenges that you think might rear their head, particularly in Asia. I'm thinking you're talking about prices not falling, and some of the perhaps longer distance, more ambitious interconnectors, like, for example, Sun Cable. There are discussions on interconnections from Sarawak, which is 700 kilometers from Singapore. Whether you see prices being even more constrained in the market and the prices continuing to kind of go up for interconnection, or do you see that sparking a kind of change where perhaps new market entrants enter and new cable suppliers enter the market?
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, well, it's being at the pointy end of delivering these, obviously investors are looking for that a degree of certainty. And from my perspective, I'll answer your question a bit more about price and new entrants a little bit later. But the first thing I was going to say is those risks and challenges need to be understood and owned by the right parties who are getting involved in that development, and understanding what those risks are through the development phase is absolutely key. I mean, I look at Singapore and the shipping lanes and just the amount of vessel movement, and think that there's some serious challenges there around the actual cable laying activity itself, but also the burial depth that's going to be required for subsea cables, and being able to get the right skills who can achieve that kind of burial is going to be key. So just because of the challenges that Singapore have got, I think you're going to need a degree of experience in terms of who undertakes some of those projects, because you start to talk about new entrants, and that's going to be key. Either new entrants or partnerships and subcontracting, some other mechanism that brings greater capacity to this market is going to be required. But investors still want that certainty, and so yeah, at the moment it's still experienced and that's weighing more heavily on the mind of developers in order to oversee these significant challenges. So I think it's I suppose what I hope for as being on the developer side is more partnership, more collaboration, which will drive a bigger pool and experience that people can draw from. You know, I don't know if that exactly answered the question, but there are some significant challenges out there.
Yeah, I can see those challenges, and I guess you know, it's not just electrical interconnection between countries, but it's also, of course, we're talking with some of the experience you're describing is very applicable to what you see behind me, which is the offshore wind market. We're seeing that go further offshore. You know, some parts of Asia get deep very quickly, and so we're looking at floating, and then there's a whole different set of challenges associated with offshore cabling in those situations. So I will be interested to see when some new cable manufacturers enter the market and see what that does to price. But perhaps in the short term, we're going to see price rises if we see some significant kind of significant orders for cables, shall we say, in the short term.
Yeah, short term, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a bit like battery prices over the last few years. You know, everyone's been predicting them to fall, and over a 20-year period, I'm sure they will. But in the short term, they've gone up because the market is constrained. And one would imagine the same to happen with. And it's not just cables, right? It's plows, it's
vessels,
cable laying vessels, skills, etc., etc. Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, and Ian. I mean, really interesting perspectives, and it's a really interesting part of the market at the moment. I just wanted to come in very quickly, which might be slightly more optimistic of me, but we are talking about geographically quite separate markets. And Ian, I know the conversations that you and I will have had with UK and European-based developers and manufacturers. There is a real constraint in that market, a tightness in that market. I guess the good news for ASEAN is that there are a number of equipment suppliers in Asia who, due to the transport cost of getting, you know, the ships, the raw materials, the manufactured cables over to Europe, haven't quite cracked the entry into the European market, with a few exceptions. But there is a wealth of experience and capacity, I guess, in the Asian supply chain, which might be more competitively priced or more readily available for the ASEAN market. And so what we don't want to see, obviously, is splintered geographies and completely separate markets without that sharing of experience and knowledge that Ian mentioned. But it may be that for the heavier equipment, there is a sort of price competitiveness point that the ASEAN market can access in a way that's more you know, readily available than the European market, which might be a success story.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's interesting. And I guess, you know, of course, this market hasn't got very much offshore wind yet, but it will most certainly have to develop its own supply chains, not least because of the requirements for you know, through procurement for homegrown capabilities and home manufacturing. And I was actually going to ask you a follow-up question on that, Stuart. I mean, if there was one lesson that you were going to pick from the UK's or Europe's experience, right from the start of developing the interconnector market down into the delivery element, what would be the key lesson that you wish you'd learnt beforehand?
Well, it's a really difficult question, Thomas. Just to pick one, I had a few listed on my presentation, but I guess the common theme there, and through what Ian was talking about, is early collaboration. And for me, that's, from a regulator's perspective, that's fundamentally important between Ofgem as the GB regulator and our counterparts, whether it's in France or Norway or Belgium or elsewhere. It's fundamentally important between governments. We've talked about the importance of the sort of political buy-in and the government-to-government collaboration partnerships. And then, the key thing through EANS is development of a supply chain that collaborates well between the project developers, between the installers, the manufacturers, and so on. So for me, the key lesson really is going to be about collaborating early, setting common objectives, and then working together to get around those. And if you can do that in ASEAN, then I think you can take a couple of years off the program in Europe. But I think it's been something that, it really has at each stage of the value chain been shown to be fundamentally important. And the projects that do collaborate early and do put that effort in at the start tend to be delivered, to cost and to schedule, whereas the projects that perhaps leave that slightly more fragmented approach tend to be the ones that face more deliverability challenges later in the schedule.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm maybe perhaps I'm a little bit pessimistic, but my view of the landscape at the moment across ASEAN is that actually that collaboration G2G isn't yet occurring. Malaysia's moratorium on the export of green electricity, partly it's totally understandable. It's got ambitions to develop its own renewable electricity and kind of wants to focus on that and using it indigenously, but that is perhaps stifling some of the links. And I just very briefly wanted to come to you, Akbar, on that. I mean, as technical director, or as technical lead for the ASEAN Power Grid, I don't know how much you get involved, but to what extent are you seeing that collaboration occurring between countries, and are you getting involved in trying to resolve some of those issues? How are you kind of seeing that landscape?
Yeah, in terms of this particular issue on the government to government agreement, or we say that must be come with the term intergovernmental agreement. That should be the main first entry to have the power trading happening between bilateral or let's say more than two countries, as happening with LTMS, BIP, and as the ASEAN Centre for Energy, who also one of the APG energy bodies that our job is to faster the APG planning to the implementation, and to solve the particular political issue, regulatory issues, as well as the technical and financial issues happening to hindering to move the APG planning to the implementation. As we see that we have done several studies on the technicality of the ASEAN Power Grid. We also currently have the study on the institutional work, and also on how to formalize the intergovernmental agreement in order to fasten the progress of the electricity trading among countries. We see that from the governmental, then the implementation to the ministerial, and then to the technical of our utilities. We see the many categories of our level of agreement that we need to standardize among the ASEAN member states. That could be the main reference on how to fasten the collaboration for the future APG.
Yeah, some interesting challenges there. and perhaps a call for you know, continued international work G2G to try and continue to improve that collaboration. So yeah, just perhaps one to watch for the future. I would remind everyone that there is the ability to ask some questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to go to those. Please continue to send those through. The first question I wanted to raise, Singapore is looking to import 4 gigawatts of clean power, and with the constraints on the supply and geopolitical aspects, can any of you think how Singapore can fulfill these objectives for import? I don't know, Akbar, whether that's best applied to you, or whether Ian, you want to take that one.
I was going to take it a little bit of it, if that was all right. Sorry, waving my hand about. I think one of the solutions, and again, it's been a common thing that both Stuart and I have been saying about this collaboration aspect, and certainly in relation to supply chain constraints, I think that's something that really ought to be thought about. I mean, that's a significant amount of interconnection that's going to be required. And the first thing I would say is try and consider that as a proper program, a proper portfolio of projects, working with the supply chain about, you know, when can they manufacture the capacity that you need, when are, you know, key vessels available and the like. So if you're not careful and you try and do things without that kind of collaboration, you'll create a real competition in the market. You'll be driving prices up. You'll be really squeezing that capability, as opposed to, right, okay, well, let's look at this as a proper program portfolio of projects that you're going to bring on, and working with the supply chain to enable that to happen in a realistic fashion. Because that's the other thing you want to do when you work with supply chain is give them, you know, something that is truly deliverable, that is possible within the right programs and constraints that they've got. You know, you can't set too unrealistic goals, or you know, you'll scare them off. They won't see that the project is truly deliverable, and won't necessarily prioritize it. They've got to feel, and that's something else that we've had through supply chain. The supply chain's got to feel that this is a real project. It's got a real possibility of delivery, and that they're the right people to help you with specific challenges, whether that's you know, burial depth, and they've got the right equipment, and they see that they're well placed to be involved in that project. By working with the supply chain in that way, you'll get them to take the project seriously. You'll be able to get them to help you with the significant challenges that particular project might have. But like I say, it's that collaboration again. Without collaboration, like I say, you'll get stacking of projects. You'll get a real demand on a limited amount of resources. I'll stop.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks. Akbar, do you think the 4 gigawatts is realistic within the time frame?
By 2040, you mean the interconnection capacity, or the 4 gigawatt of wind power from Singapore?
Yeah, well, I mean, the question and the 4 gigawatts has been put out. The open tender, I think, closes in a year's time, obviously to be built by about 2030, 2035. So 4 gigawatts to Singapore.
This could be challenging, as Ian would say, that require a lot of collaboration to solve this and to manage, achieve this 4 gigawatt of clean power to Singapore. However, if we could address that issue, we see that potential from the neighboring countries, that Singapore located are let's say that in Indonesia, in Sumatra, we have the abundance of the geothermal, hydropower, and solar resources that could be delivered to Singapore once that we clear the regulatory issue, and as well as the supply chains and the governmental agreement in that point. And we see that the Law PDR itself as being called as the battery of the region, that they have abundance of the hydropower that could supply to balancing this clean power to the all the regions. And in that case, if the APG also support to achieve some of the member states to the aspiration to have the energy transition within each country. I think that's one could answer that question, Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It feels to me like the challenges associated with that large tender are at least at the moment at the G2G level, and you know, having been involved with that process from a technical perspective, I think what we see is no shortage of potential projects. As EMA announced, there were quite a number of bidders into that process, but the G2G agreements weren't quite there. So I think that's some of the challenges. I guess, you know, the alternatives to that are things like some cable, but they come at a very significant price, I believe. Out in the market there, you know, it's sort of 10 times the scale of Noi Connect, and does have to go across the Timor Trench. So challenges from a technical perspective, really probably on the edge of what some of the technologies can achieve. I guess the alternatives are, you know, direct interconnectors across the Gulf of Thailand, and I know MTI was even considering an interconnection to China. So yeah, I think the 4 gigawatts at the moment, to answer that question, looks quite challenging. The next question was, what's the alternative, given the sovereign desire to hold on to electrons generated in country? Perhaps the case is stronger for the movement of molecules in the form of ammonia. But, you know, as we know, the challenges with ammonia are the exceedingly high energy penalty paid in the conversion of electricity into ammonia, and that really limits the well, puts a distance limit on the export of energy from one country to the other. Yes, from Australia, perhaps it's cheaper to go down the route of hydrogen rather than in some form, rather than electrical interconnectors, but an electrical interconnector from Australia is a very extreme answer, I would suggest. I'm going to, considering the challenges of the implementation, again, there's another question on shipping ammonia. I don't know if anyone has a particular interest in or something to say about ammonia. I'll leave that open to all of you on the floor. What's your thoughts on ammonia versus electrical interconnectors? No one's jumping up and down on that one. You know, go, Stuart.
I will give a very reactionary view, because I don't know anything about ammonia. So I'm not best placed to comment on that, but I guess it comes back to that fundamental question about considering your alternatives and setting your objectives early. And electrical interconnection is one part of the puzzle. Storage is another, you know, ammonia and hydrogen is another. And so for us in the UK, the solution's always been really to think early about what the different options are, weigh up those pros and cons. And because we're talking about international pictures, some governments might have a different view on the merits of each of those options compared to others. And so it really comes back to that question about early dialogue. And there was, as part of that question, I think, a commentary on sort of keeping the clean electrons within a sovereign country to use there. I think the European experience there has been actually quite positive in that connecting over a larger area allows you to specialise regionally. I touched very briefly on the sort of changing business models for or value drivers for interconnection in Europe, and that means that, you know, in the UK, for example, we're building far more wind than we will require to meet our own domestic needs. But wind, you know, we are a market that has an abundance of wind, but it is, you know, difficult to predict on a long term, and so we need to have a surplus in generation there. It then makes sense that when it is very windy and we're producing more than we can use sensibly in the UK, for us to then export that. And if you can specialize regionally, geographically, then in Europe the picture is, you know, the GB market will have a lot of wind, the German market has a lot of solar and wind, the Norwegian market has a lot of hydro, the French market has a lot of nuclear, and then you're able to sort of weigh up those complementarities. So it's not necessarily a case of keep it to yourself or export it. Those two can work quite well in sync and in tandem.
Yeah, yeah, I would totally agree with that. And yeah, no, that's a good point, Stuart. And I think you know, what we've also seen in terms of security of supply, you know, Ukraine has been able to keep its lights on partly because it's synced with the European grid and has been able to have that interconnection and the big link with what is a big collective group. So either climate or external forces on the ASEAN market could give each country greater security of supply than keeping it indigenously. And I like your point about regional, you know, capability. That's absolutely the true. I mean, we're on the equator in Singapore, and it's not very windy, right? There is just no wind to speak of, whether it's onshore or offshore, up into Malaysia, and not very much in Indonesia. But there's hydro and there's solar in Indonesia and Malaysia. You go a bit further north into Thailand, into Philippines, and you see plenty of wind and offshore wind capability. In Sarawak, we see lots of hydro. So I guess what it could, you know, with good dialogue across ASEAN, actually everyone's power security could increase. And there's an interesting question about how that comes to pass. Obviously, the European Union was quite a strong thing in driving some of that in the early days, and that's obviously continued post-Brexit. So interesting times to think about how that might happen. In terms of kind of looking at the future of regulation in Europe and the UK, Stuart, you talked a little bit about round 3 coming up. How do you see the kind of market developing in the future? Do you see big changes in the way either the regulation happens across border or the way the markets happen across border, or are we just simply talking about technology development and general market experience? Or is there a fundamental change coming, I guess, is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, I think there is, and I'll speak from the UK perspective. You mentioned Brexit there, Thomas, and that is something that has led to changes in the way that we work with our counterparts. Obviously, we're no longer part of the European single energy market, and so we need to, you know, come back to that question about collaboration and thinking in advance about how we make sure that the models that we've relied on historically remain, you know, fit for purpose and appropriate going forward to recognise the new political context in the UK. But I think there is a broader change, and I mentioned it very briefly in my first slide, which is historically we talked about market integration being the key driver of interconnectivity and the value of interconnection. And that was so that power could be moved around from lower to higher price markets. You know, you open up the wider market area, you get to a more efficient dispatch solution overall, and you come to a, you know, overall a lower European market price. And that's been the fundamental driver of new projects over the past decade. It's been sort of working to understand those long-term price differentials and to provide a market opportunity to arbitrage between countries on the back of that. The big change for me is renewables, and we just talked about it in the ASEAN context, but it's the same in Europe. As we move to a net zero power system, the fundamental driver of the value of interconnection between markets will be to move around those green electrons and to allow countries to balance and to manage intermittency and flexibility at a system level. And so the one of the challenges for us is what does that mean for the what do interconnectors start to look like? What does the business model look like? What does the regulatory model need to look like in that context? And the ability for part of our cap and floor regime has always been that we expect developers to have a view of long-term revenues driven by price differences. But if the dispatch is much shorter term based on weather patterns and based on intermittency, then developers perhaps don't have that same certainty over the long term as to the market that they're, you know, planning to connect to. And so our regulatory framework needs to change and adapt to that context as well. And that's something we've been working through over the past couple of years with a view to this third application round. The other thing that I briefly touched on was multi-purpose interconnectors. And as the European market moves towards renewables, you mentioned, Thomas, earlier, the constraints on things like cables, installation vessels, you know, often interconnection, domestic transmission networks and offshore wind all require the same ships and the same, you know, resources in the same spaces. And so with multi-purpose interconnectors, we're trying to deliver a regulatory framework that helps to directly interconnect but also connect offshore wind on the way, which starts to look more like a meshed grid or a hybrid grid solution rather than a point-to-point electrical interconnector. And so we're having to proactively work with other governments and with industry and with supply chain to try to overcome the barriers to those sorts of development. And the I guess the gain there, the benefit there is that overall, as Ian mentioned, programs are more transparent and more scheduled, you know, well planned and well scheduled, and we can reduce the amount of equipment and the amount of installation that's needed overall to get to the energy objectives that we do have. And if we can do that, it means you get to the same end point but with less infrastructure, with a lower footprint on the environment, a lower footprint for, you know, the communities that are hosting these sorts of assets and these sorts of infrastructures, and therefore it's a more optimized solution for society as a whole.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think, you know, the European grids have changed. There are some grids which have very high penetration of renewables. I'm thinking perhaps Denmark, where interconnection, particularly to their neighbours with lots of hydro, has been essential in keeping their lights on. But they have been able to get to an almost 100% renewable grid. And what we see in ASEAN is still very much a centralized solution of large scale, quite a lot of thermal, funding for coal-fired power stations has actually gone up this year across ASEAN. So, you know, the fundamental changes of going from a, you know, spinning inertia-based system, centralized system, controlled by state-owned utilities, towards a diversified renewables intermittent grid kind of necessitates that interconnection for everyone's security of supply, and should really drive down the price in the long term. And I was just wondering whether, Akbar, you're starting to see that those considerations of a kind of webbed grid occurring in your planning for the ASEAN Power Grid, as opposed to a single point-to-point solution that we're thinking of.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. As we learn as well from the different region on how they first conduct their interconnection among countries. They started by unilateral or point-to-point, and then cross-border interconnection, and then move up to the sub-regional level, where we see that in FPG we differentiate the 3 sub-regions. In the north, we see the lower Mekong sub-region, which consists of Vietnam, Laos, PDR, Thailand, Myanmar, and also Cambodia, and the southern part of the ASEAN Power Grid, which consists of the Indonesia, Sumatra, Java, Malaysia, and also Singapore. And we also have the eastern part of the ASEAN Power Grid, we have the Philippines, Sabah, Sarawak, and also the Borneo, Kalimantan. And then after we have the sub-regional level integration, we have this ultimate goal of the ASEAN Power Grid, which are connecting all these sub-region to one ASEAN Power Grid level. And by that, we are trying to move the FPG planning into the implementation by developing some kind of the roadmap. And also in the support of that, we developing the financial framework and the monitoring basis, which could monitor the project with the schedule, which one is the having the delay, and what is identify what is the problem, whether it's the technical, the regulation, or the financial itself. And by that, we hope that we will have the fully integrated system in the next decades, by moving the integration on this ASEAN context.
Yeah, you see, there it is. That interconnection allows the whole region to benefit from renewables, and as we know, renewables are lower priced as compared to even coal these days. The challenge is the intermittency between them, but an interconnected grid allows us to overcome that challenge. So an interesting call to arms, perhaps, for ASEAN and the entire region to up the diplomacy on interconnection between countries, as actually it does have a benefit to all. So thinking kind of finally about how we take that forward, perhaps I'd just ask Ian whether you have any thoughts on what might bring investment into the market and kind of attract activity from the private sector to kind of join the party once the G2G element has been resolved.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, well, investors like, low risk and stability, and a sort of a long-term understanding of the regulatory regime that they are going to be investing into, and being able to communicate that ambition to the investment community, but in a stable manner, in a what we've been seeing as we've moved to this more holistic network design. So Akbar has got a big place to play here in terms of saying, well, okay, what is it really going to look like? What do we really need? And how are we going to get from point A to point B in a manner that everybody can see and understand that they've got their part to play. They've got more certainty of timescales, etc. I mean, this is still a risky business, a challenging business. These cables have got to be installed in challenging conditions, and so the risk has got to be worth the reward. And so again, it comes back to that collaboration, that understanding of common goals, that understanding of what that future network is going to look like, and the regulatory framework that's going to govern it.
Well, there we are, another call to arms for the G2G discussion. Well, thank you all. It's been a really interesting discussion. Really enjoyed those discussions. Thank you to Stuart from Ofgem, Stuart Brawland from Ofgem. Thank you to Akbar for stepping in at the last minute from the ASEAN Centre for Energy, and thanks to Ian from Arup. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, and thank you as well for moderating this session ably. I thought it was really interesting. And just reflecting on, we actually called the panel ASEAN Power Grid and Green Imports to Singapore. And as we talked about the region, of course, one person's imports is another person's exports. And we touched on that resource nationalism point as well as a lot of the technical issues and whether there are alternatives. And I think the point Stuart was making there about getting the planning up front, but also looking at the outcomes. What's the desired outcome rather than sort of just plug and play one particular solution. So yeah, it's interesting that we touched on ammonia there and some questions coming in on that, which I thought was really interesting. And then of course, capacity building, and we need to build capacity for all those projects that Akbar put up there on his slide. And that will all be available because this will be replayed on the BritCham's YouTube channel. So my thanks once again to everybody. For those of you who are still joining and listening and involved in the chamber, there's a number of activities that are coming up. This is just a few of them. You can see there we've got planning on the smooth and tax efficient move to the UK. Well, that would be a good one. Although, of course, the directions in this is this way as well. So I hope that one day we'll have a session on moving this direction. But it'd be very interesting to listen to that. The future of finance, and that's led by our banking committee. A networking session. We love good networking at BritCham, and a session coming up on 4th of November for everyone at Eden Hall, thanks to the High Commissioner. And then a women's cross chamber after work, and I think that's being held with the Swedish chamber and possibly some others. So lots of activity happening here in Singapore, which would be good. And a final reminder from me that we can see everybody live. It won't be online, but we'll see you live at Singapore International Energy Week, where BritCham is again a partner of the whole event. And we have our own think tank on opportunities from collaborating on decarbonisation in ASEAN. And everyone's welcome, but please sign up for that on the Singapore International Energy Week website. So with that, it's thank you once again for me, and wrapping up the session, and hope to see you all again shortly. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool.